Hey everybody, and welcome to Ideas Having Sex with Chris Kaufman. I'm Chris Kaufman, and first of all, please stop whatever you're doing right now and go and rate our show wherever you listen to it. We are now streaming on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Google Podcast, and Stitcher. All you have to do is hit the little star button and pick whatever number of stars you feel is appropriate. Be honest, I don't care. 5 stars, 6, 7, doesn't matter to me. I'm just gonna wait while you pause it and go ahead and do that. Okay, welcome back, and on with the show. Today, I am joined by Dr. Kristian Niemietz. Kristian received his PhD in political economy from King's College in London. He is a regular contributor to various journals in the UK and Germany and is a senior research fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs, as well as the author of several books, including the title we're discussing today, Socialism, the Failed Idea That Never Dies. This is my conversation with Kristian Niemietz. Kristian, can you say, first of all, am I saying your name correctly?
Yes, perfect.
Awesome. Can you say a little bit about what your book is about in a broad overview?
It's about the return of socialism as a mainstream ideology. Because, as you know, for a long time, it was a common perception that socialism sort of ended with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and that since then, it's been a preserve of fringe groups and cranks. But then around 2015, there was a massive revival going on. You had political movements, political candidates in a number of Western countries that were self-described socialists and having quite a lot of success. Especially among young people, you had a return of socialism as repackaged as a hip and trendy youth movement. You had mass movements suddenly around this with new socialist publications springing up all over the place. And I just wanted to address the issue, set out in more detail what's actually wrong with socialism, because I did notice at the time that a lot of people on my side of the argument, by which I mean free marketeers, liberals in the European sense, liberal in the sense of classical liberal / libertarian, didn't really know how to react to this socialism revival, because they had just forgotten how to argue properly with socialist ideas. Here in Britain, if my predecessors at the Institute, people who were there in the 60s, maybe 70s, they would have known how to do that, because then socialism was a major force. You had mainstream political movements that that actively promoted a socialist economy. It's just that certainly after the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was a perception that you don't have to do that anymore. People had forgotten how to argue with socialists. It was just presumed something obvious. Socialism has failed. That's all you have to know about it. And then you had these people coming up and saying, well, no, it's not that socialism has failed. It has just not been properly tried. And I wanted to address that argument once and for all. Why, firstly, on the theoretical level, there are good reasons why socialism has always failed. It's not that it's just been badly done. But also, I wanted to show that that claim, it wasn't real socialism. Real socialism has never been tried. I want to show that that is really just an excuse, even if the people making that excuse aren't necessarily aware of it. But what I'm showing is that socialists have historically only made that claim once a socialist regime was already discredited, once it had become an embarrassment. Most recent example, we saw this in real time a couple of years ago with Venezuela. Used to be massively popular among Western intellectuals from about 2005 to 2013-14. And then when their economy collapsed and you had a massive humanitarian crisis, suddenly you did see socialists saying, well, but it was never truly socialism. And I said, hang on, that's not what you said 2 or 3 years ago. I can remember articles from you saying Venezuela is real socialism and it's fantastic. And I just went through several historic examples. I found out that this Venezuela episode was not the first time that this happened. This happened pretty much with every socialist regime. Soviet Union, Maoist China, North Korea, even Albania, Cambodia, under the Khmer Rouge, you name it, everywhere, every time there was a socialist regime somewhere in the world, you had Western intellectuals first praising it to the skies, saying, this is real socialism, this is the real thing, you see, it works. And then in hindsight, once the regime is discredited, then they suddenly roll back and said, oh no, that was never socialism. You just don't understand socialism.
You described after the fall of the Berlin Wall that people didn't think they needed to argue against socialism anymore.
Yeah.
But it seems like from reading your book, it seems like the gap between the fall of the Berlin Wall and I guess the popularity of Venezuela fits pretty neatly in with the rest of the pattern you describe. I mean, there's always the decline of popularity of some regime and then maybe some time elapses, or maybe we were just in a lull. There just wasn't any good examples around. And for those of us who lived through it, we maybe assumed because the end of the Cold War that we didn't have to live through it, but it was from the perspective of intellectuals, it was just a dearth of examples to be praised.
Yes, there was that. There was, of course, the impression that, even though at around that time, late 80s, most Western intellectuals had successfully distanced themselves from Eastern Bloc socialism. But nonetheless, it still had a reputational effect. If you have so many regimes of that persuasion collapsing
all at once.
Yeah, exactly. Then you can say, oh no, my kind of socialism is different. But that just rings a bit hollow. If there are so many examples of it failing, it would be a bit like, let's say you had a drug, some medicine that causes horrible side effects among thousands of people, and you come up and say, well, but they just got the dosage wrong, or they just took it in the wrong way. The drug is actually perfectly safe. Well, you can say that a generation later, maybe when nobody actively remembers the horror stories around that drug. But if it has just happened, if it's still in the news regularly, then that claim will just sound a bit hollow. And that was what happened in the 90s. So that there were always people saying socialism has just not been properly tried. That it's not that that ever completely went away. It was just in the 90s, in the early 2000s, it was not part of the mainstream. And even during the Venezuela wave, it was not exactly a mass movement. It was still something that was limited to students, intellectuals, but it's not that you had a phenomenon like, let's say, the wave of popularity in the US, the Bernie Sanders movement, or here in Britain, the Corbyn movement. These were really mass movements. This wasn't just a socialist reading group at some university. But here we have festivals where people were actively chanting the name of the dear leader, proper mass movements, including people who would otherwise not consider themselves maybe very political. And there you can say we were back to the way it was in the 60s, where you had the student protesters of the time, where a lot of them just would have described themselves as Marxists of one variety or another.
Can you say something about how you are defining socialism in your book? Because this is not like a polemical screed where you're accusing any government with high taxes and a welfare state of being socialist. Just to make that clear, when I first was hearing about this book, I thought it might be kind of a polemic. And then I started reading it and I was like, oh, this is a well-researched academic book and very sober in tone. And you distinguish between like Nordic social democracies and socialist countries. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yes, that's exactly right. I mean, well, first of all, the Nordic countries, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, they are clearly capitalist economies. The vast majority of companies in those countries are privately owned, and the economies are coordinated by market prices. There is no government planning bureau or anything of that. So they are as capitalist as the United States or Britain. It's just that they have higher taxes and very generous welfare states. That's not socialism. And let's say the more outspoken members of this new socialist movement, they also see it that way. there are the people the members of this millennial socialist movement who write books, record podcasts. Some of them say very explicitly, Denmark, Sweden, that's not what we want. They actively distance themselves from that. So I'm simply defining socialism in the same way in which the current socialists are defining it. I'm not coming up with some strawman definition. I stick to the classic conventional definition. For most of its history, socialism used to mean collective ownership of the means of production, and this idea that somehow social democracies, countries with high taxes, generous welfare states, that's somehow socialist. That's a modern day linguistic confusion. That's something that I only came across when I started writing that book. That I did come across people who, when I asked them, okay, where is your favorite example of socialism, that somebody would say, well, Sweden or Denmark. I thought, what? It's a relatively new thing. Now, I'm not a social democrat myself. I have my criticism of economic models like in Denmark or Sweden. I'm just saying that's not what I do in this book. For the purposes of this book, it doesn't matter whether you are a libertarian free marketeer or whether you are a Nordic type social democrat. As long as you are broadly in favor of the market economy, I think you should. You will probably agree with 99% of that book. Well, I'm hoping, at least. I mean, I've had some favorable reviews from social democrats who recognize that quite clearly, who are saying this is not simply an attempt to say all lefties are bad or all lefties are somehow socialists. I make quite clear, if you are a Nordic type social democrat, I'm not talking about you.
Can you steel man the claim that true socialism hasn't been tried? You kind of rip that argument to shreds in the book, but what do you think is the most charitable case for that claim?
Well, it's hard to steel man. I think the versions of it that we see are actually as good as it gets. The idea is that what Marx and Engels originally wanted when they talked about socialism or communism, they used them more or less synonymously, was a democratically planned economy. So they did not want a technocratic elite in charge. They did not want a party elite in charge. They wanted a grassroots democracy where workers get together in factories, in assemblies, and collectively plan their economy. That was always the idea, but that, of course, never happened. If you look at actual examples of socialist economies, it was never anything like that. It was never democratic. It was either from early on quite dictatorial and technocratic, or at least it descended into that over time. So Venezuela, since I mentioned that example, that was initially a democracy. Chavez was re-elected several times and won referendums as well. So clearly, initially, a perfectly legitimate democratic government. That wasn't the issue. It just descended into authoritarianism over time.
And not just the democratic government, but you talk about how early on in Venezuela's experiments with socialism, it sounds like it was a lot of essentially state-supported and subsidized workers' cooperatives that eventually Chavez was like, well, these are just capitalist organizations run by workers. This is no good.
Yes. That's the thing. They did try. Chavez initially distanced himself from all the earlier examples and said, my kind of socialism will be nothing like what you probably imagine. We're doing socialism of the 21st century. It will be completely different. He called the Soviet Union a perversion of socialism. So very much like millennial socialists today, like your average Bernie bro or Corbynista would argue today. So that's always been the idea, so that socialism means a democratically run economy. It never turned out that way. Socialists, or modern day socialists, millennial socialists, conclude from that it just hasn't been properly tried, that if somebody talks about a democratically run economy and then produces a horrible technocratic dictatorship, their conclusion is, well, those people cannot have been honest in their intentions. They may have promised one thing, they may have used that democratic rhetoric, but they cannot have meant it really. Whereas I would say, no, most of those people genuinely did mean it when they said we want to create a democratically run economy. It's just that they realized once they were in power that cannot be done, that there is no mechanism for, if you take a country like Britain, a population of 65 million people, how are they supposed to run their economy collectively, democratically? How's that supposed to work? Nobody has ever come up with a mechanism of how you could do that. Of course, you can have a parliament that's democratically elected, and that parliament, I guess, can then appoint people to a socialist planning board or whatever. But so then it would be something that you could describe as democratic. But that would then just be like, let's say, a central bank nowadays, the Federal Reserve Bank. Nobody would say that the Fed is a democratically run organization. So you can have democratic socialism in that sense, that you have a democratically elected government in place, and that they appoint a planning board or state managers or whatever. But that would still be an extremely technocratic solution. And I have yet to see any socialists explain to me how you can run an economy democratically, because we can see already, even with the scope that modern governments have today, that in a lot of areas public engagement is just very low. Here in Britain, we have a National Health Service. As you know, we could, in principle, it is possible for people to get involved at the local level and have a bit of a say about how that's run. But in practice, almost nobody does that, and that's because, well, these are questions that are inherently very technical. Ultimately, it's not something that you can do with mass participation. Ultimately, this you will end up with experts running those parts of the economy. It just cannot realistically be done in a democratic way.
I think you're touching on it right now, but you talk about how it's not just an accident or perversion of personalities or corruption that these socialist experiments turn quite authoritarian. There's some underlying structural reason for it. What do you think that reason is?
Socialist regimes are not just oppressive. What's important to note is that they are all oppressive in similar ways. So it's not randomly. It's not that they say on Mondays you're not allowed to eat potatoes. So it's not that they come up with random rules just to make life difficult. It always happens in predictable ways, and that is related to the nature of a planned economy. When you plan an economy, the planning board, the central authority, must have the power to direct the factors of production. And of course, the main factor of production is labor. So the reason why Stalin relocated huge groups of the population, that he uprooted population groups, saying, okay, you have to move over there, somewhere in the wilderness, and if loads of you starve in the process, I don't care. There you could say, okay, that was a mix. The fact that it was done in this brutal way, that was because Stalin was a psychopath, and with a nicer Stalin, it might not have been quite so catastrophic. But the fact that there was that the state had this power to move people around in this way and not allow free movement, free choice of jobs, of where you want to live. The fact that those freedoms didn't exist, that was systematic. That's something that didn't improve much after Stalin's death either. That's just how a planned economy is supposed to work. And that's the reason why, even in the Soviet Union, I looked a bit at their migration policies and or the internal migration policies. You had, after the Russian Revolution, it was still possible to move around in Russia freely. So they banned emigration from the country quite early on. But for a couple of years, you were still allowed to move between cities. You could have moved from Leningrad to Moscow. They stopped that when they rolled out the first 5-year plan. And that's not a coincidence, because you have state-planned industries suddenly, state-planned housing. So in order for that to work, to match workers to factories to houses, you need the power to say, you live here and you can't go away. And the same thing then happened again later after the Chinese Revolution, that they also brought in this system of internal passports, meaning that you can't freely move within the country just because you want to. Something like that existed in East Germany as well. It wasn't literally internal passports. You could travel, but moving was just very difficult, mostly because you would have needed somewhere to stay, and that would have been state housing. So it's all allocated by the state. So this centralization of power, that's inevitable under socialism. I'd say even if we had a perfectly democratic socialist government, it would still be authoritarian. Because even democracies can be authoritarian. You can have a tyrannical majority. You can have a government that's very bossy, even if it is backed by 50% plus one of the population.
The examples you gave of the internal passports and also restrictions on emigration, that was eye-opening. I had always, without giving it too much thought, just assumed it was more an issue of power, of authoritarian states not wanting to lose their population base or something like that, or wanting to keep tabs on people for reasons of like surveillance or something like that. But it makes more sense, I think, on the much more mundane economic level of, no, you as a person are a factor of production. You are a laborer. And I've written a very detailed plan about where you're supposed to be. And if you go moving to Belgium, that's going to screw everything up. So you're staying right where you are. I hadn't really considered that. And it makes a lot of sense. And especially like you mentioned the pattern, like this is not something that happened just in the Soviet Union. This is a pattern in all or nearly all of the countries you go over.
That's exactly right, because sometimes that's where socialist regimes differ from more conventional types of dictatorships, because sometimes dictators are quite keen on emigration because it means opponent. It's an easy way to get rid of opponents of the
people
regime.
Likely to emigrate are the people probably not too happy with your regime. So great,
exactly,
get out of here.
Yes, and that existed to a very tiny extent in socialist countries as well. East Germany sometimes exiled people, artists, where they knew, okay, this person is a troublemaker, they're against us, and losing them wasn't that big a deal for them because it was smaller numbers, and if they're artists, then nice to have, but it's not like losing lots of people lots of engineers or doctors. But yes, it was that was exactly the pattern, that it was always about preserving your labor force. And that's also why it's not a coincidence that that East Germany was more restrictive than even some of its neighbors. That's because, of course, in East Germany had it much easier to emigrate to a capitalist alternative, which was West Germany. They spoke the same language. They had a German passport, where somebody from, let's say, Yugoslavia would not have been automatically accepted in West Germany. So since it was much easier for East Germans to leave, that's why the regime also had to be more draconian. But it really was driven by economic considerations. They didn't have this immigration restriction right from the start in the beginning. And for a couple of years, you could freely move from East to West Germany. It's just that they lost hundreds of thousands of people in that way every year. And that messed up their 5-year plans. Then if you suddenly have thousands of people in a particular sector leaving, and your 5-year plan is based on the population numbers that you had at the time the plan was drafted, well, then you have a problem, because then your plan is totally out of date. And you can't then say, okay, let's now we need to draft a completely new plan. That just messes everything up, and that's why they had to go more and more restrictive. They tried milder measures first. They tried to appeal to a sense of socialist patriotism, tried to tell people, yes, you can go over there. They have more consumer goods, but life is not all about that. And aren't you proud of the fact that we are building the socialist paradise here? But it's just that appealed to very few people.
And then those damn saboteurs have to emigrate.
And yeah, and that's another thing that that's also very typical of socialist regimes. So when something goes wrong economically, you have to find imaginary saboteurs, someone to blame. Because
you mentioned that East Germany had more restrictive immigration or internal passport rules, or maybe specifically immigration rules than even some of their neighbors, because of the ease with which East Germans could go to West Germany and find a relatively similar cultural and linguistic society. Does that pattern hold for North Korea for a similar reason, that the opportunity to migrate to South Korea makes it more tempting and necessary for them to really clamp down, more so than even China, for instance?
Yes, absolutely. That would be the reason why North Korea is much more restrictive than, say, Cuba. Cuba does, well, okay, they had a migration ban for most of the time, but they have relaxed that quite a bit in recent years. So there you can technically emigrate. It's just that a Cuban, I don't know the exact rules there, but I would imagine that if a Cuban migrates to Florida, they would not have an automatic right to live and work there. Well, and there is the language barrier, even though Florida has a huge Hispanic population. But yeah, you are then in a country where the official language is English, and which you might not be fluent in. So they can therefore afford to be a bit less extreme in their restrictions. North Korea, of course, can't do that. And even with the draconian restrictions that they have, lots of people still try to escape. That's something that we don't know the details about. But if they ever get a reunification, and those records will be released, I'm sure quite a lot of horror stories will emerge then. Nowadays, you could say North and South Korea are also in cultural terms further apart than East and West Germany ever were. So even if they liberalized it a little bit, if they allowed some loopholes, it could be that that modern day North Koreans would just have trouble fitting in South Korea. It would be, they might think, okay, these people speak the same language and we look the same. But nonetheless, if you had such big differences for such a long time, I would imagine that it feels like a foreign country to them. I mean, even between East and West Germany, there were notable differences. Hard to exactly put it into words, but I mean, I moved to Eastern Germany 12 years after reunification, and
you were born in West Germany?
Yes, I'm West German. I moved to East Berlin in 2001. It still felt in a lot of ways like a different country, but of course not in the sense that would have prevented migration. So that's why as soon as just before the fall of the Berlin Wall, a couple of months before, there was the opening of the border fence between Austria and Hungary, and they just opened it briefly. There was a festival in the border area, and they had then thousands of East Germans who traveled to Hungary and escaped to Austria in that way. So even though they had the border had been closed for decades at the time, as soon as they opened it up a little bit, thousands of people escaped. So that just showed you, as soon as you give them the tiniest loophole, they will all run away.
Yeah. Can you talk about the pattern of Western intellectuals that you go through, the honeymoon? I forget the exact details, but you talk about a consistent pattern that Western intellectuals go through with the new, sexy, exciting socialist country that then turns ugly.
Yeah, that's exactly what happens. That after a socialist revolution, you often get a bit of romanticism around it. You have a new regime in place, and they use kind of language that appeals to Western intellectuals, often the policies to go with it as well. So it's usually not just empty rhetoric. And therefore, socialist regimes are always very popular in their early days. You always get these waves of Western pilgrims, who sometimes literal pilgrims who actually physically travel there. Sometimes people just romanticize it from afar. Often you had people traveling there and then coming back and saying, this is brilliant. This is the future. I've seen it. It works. This happened in the Soviet Union in the 30s. There were thousands of Western intellectuals, by which I mean academics, writers, artists, people from the education sector, media sector, so intellectuals, broadly defined, who traveled there and who came back saying this is brilliant, and who were full of enthusiasm. And you had lots of, you can very easily find quotes from fairly prominent figures at the time who were absolutely in awe who were fawning over Stalinist Russia. This lasted for about a decade. There was it was even called the Red Decade at the time. There was a former what was he exactly? He was some correspondent in Moscow, some American journalist who later then became a critic of the Soviet Union, but he felt that he was ostracized by his fellow intellectuals for that, and I'm guessing that made him even more of an anti-communist. But he wrote about this pattern, amongst many other people, about how in the 30s it was just, if you wanted to be part of polite society, if you wanted to be considered an intellectual, you just had to be pro-Soviet. That was just the fashionable intellectual, the highbrow opinion at the time. And it was only then after the Second World War, when, with the beginning of the Cold War, suddenly the Soviet Union was an enemy, and suddenly it was no longer. If you wanted to promote socialist ideas in the West, it would be a bad idea to hold up the Soviet Union, because people would then say, wait, but the Soviet Union is, first of all, it's an enemy. And secondly, it became more widely known in the West that life in the Soviet Union wasn't pretty, something which in the 30s wasn't universally known, or there was plausible deniability still. And then you get backtracking. Then you get a period during which intellectuals just fall silent, stop talking about that example. And after a while, you have a new generation of socialists that have grown up. They have no memory of that period when that regime was romanticized, and they will just say, "Oh, that's not socialism. That's got nothing to do with us." And then they'll say that was just not real socialism, and the fact that you even bring this up just shows that you don't understand socialism. You can find this pattern repeatedly. Started with the Soviet Union in the 30s. But then if you ask anyone who went to a university in a Western country in the late 60s, early 70s, they will tell you that in their day, it was in vogue to be a Maoist. Students were using Maoist fashion. Cuba at the same time was very much in vogue. Vietnam, of course, North Vietnam at the time. So you had these waves, which later all became not real socialism, allegedly. Then you had smaller waves in the 70s around North Korea. There was a smaller Albania fan club and a Cambodia fan club. And there, Noam Chomsky was one of those people who didn't literally idolize the Khmer Rouge, but he attacked all their Western critics. So every time somebody said there's a genocide going on in Cambodia and this is a horrible regime, he attacked those people, saying this is all just capitalist propaganda. This is shoddy propaganda. You're all third-rate hacks. And he never quite said Pol Pot is brilliant, but he attacked every one of his critics. And I would say if that's what you do, if you have a go at all the critics of a regime, you have in effect taken the side of that regime, even if you never literally say, I am pro-regime. Then in the 80s, Nicaragua was the big showcase of democratic socialism, supposedly. And then there was a gap in the 90s and early 2000s, and then Venezuela was just the most recent example.
What do you think is the best candidate for the next example? Is there a current bubbling revolutionary country that you're aware of attracting some attention?
it always happens in unpredictable ways. It's usually Venezuela was, for me, it wasn't even on the map before you had this outpouring of support among socialist intellectuals for it. I think before then, I would not even have been able to locate that country on a map. But suddenly, the reason why I was then was that I was an undergraduate at the time, and suddenly there were Venezuela flags everywhere, and events where they invited speakers from there, or you had people talking about how wonderful this all was. So you can't predict that. When the book came out, there was a serious possibility that that could have been Britain. At the time, Corbyn was still leading in the polls, and he had just 1.5 years before it came out, he had almost won an election. He got 40% in a vote, and was still going from strength to strength. There was this massive youth movement around him, and just this huge enthusiasm that I had never seen that, so much enthusiasm for a politician and a political movement. So, I mean, I remember Obama mania. That was the thing when he was first elected, 2008. But even that was nothing like on the same scale as, or not that intensity as we had with the Corbyn movement. But where, yeah, that's now over. Well, not over, but it's now not at the front line of day-to-day politics anymore. Where the next one will be, I have no idea.
This might be a little bit outside of the scope of your book, but I was curious if you think that what you've documented is a part of a broader pattern. I know you mentioned Paul Hollander's work in your book, and he goes a little bit more, I think, into, and you do as well, into Western intellectual praise for right-wing dictatorships. As you know, fascism was very fashionable for a time period before they were enemies of the West. You know, places with charismatic leaders and revolutionary ideologies that seem to break with tradition, whether they be right or left wing. Now, fascism was shorter lived historically, so you don't probably have many defenders of that. But even historical examples, like I think that there were a lot of early defenses of the French Revolution. You know, the Committee of Safety or whatever it was called, before it was apparent how many people were getting their heads chopped off and killed in the streets. Do you think this is part of a broader historical pattern that's more not just limited to socialist countries?
It could well be that the French Revolution is actually the first example of it. I've read accounts of that as well, that a lot of British intellectuals loved it at the time. I'd say the socialist ones are just more sustained. It lasts longer. It can be over a decade. If you were somebody who praised a fascist regime once, then at least you would suffer some reputational damage. Whereas with the socialist ones, that never happened. I'm not aware of anyone who lost credibility because of their former support for socialist regime. These people just move on and act as if that never happened. You also get this idea that somehow the idea itself is flawless and pure, and it was only the bad implementation that is to blame. And fortunately, nobody would say that about fascism. I mean, if somebody came up and said, "Oh well, fascism has just not been properly tried," that person would immediately be disappear from public life.
That's not real fascism. Real
Yeah.
imperialism has never been tried, Kristian.
Yeah. Well, but the mere fact how absurd it sounds, even if you say it ironically, that already shows you the difference between the two.
Are there any examples that you can think of countries that don't fit in? I'm just trying to think of if there are non-socialist examples of where Singapore, as a free but like somewhat authoritarian country that had an explosive growth that was very inspiring. Like, did that inspire a lot of intellectuals to all of a sudden be fawning over it? I would think in a way that they wouldn't have to feel ashamed about, because it really did achieve a lot. But it doesn't seem like it inspires the same kind of praise.
No, it doesn't. You would get some economists who would be impressed by the growth rates and maybe write something about that, look at the causes of that, but that would be quite niche. It's not that you would get mass movements around that, and you wouldn't get Singapore fan clubs. you would never see, let's say, a Singapore solidarity campaign at a university in the way that we absolutely have. Cuba solidarity campaigns, they still exist. Venezuela solidarity campaigns, well, they've gone down a bit in popularity and membership numbers, but they also still exist. And no, it's in countries that have big achievements, but that have them for the wrong reason from the perspective of a conventional Western intellectual. That would just not be very inspiring. It might attract some acknowledgement. You might say, okay, yes, these numbers look pretty good. They must be doing something right. But it doesn't go beyond that. It would not be considered something inspiring. You would say, okay, they're doing something right. The economic numbers look okay, but you wouldn't say this is a model for a new society. You wouldn't get any of this romantic rhetoric that you get around socialist examples. And that's a good thing. I mean, I don't think we should do what socialist intellectuals are doing just in reverse. We shouldn't romanticize other places. We should say, okay, Hong Kong, Singapore, they've clearly done very well economically. There's lessons to be learned from them, but we shouldn't romanticize those places.
You talk about two examples of all of the countries you go through that don't fit neatly into the pattern you describe, East Germany and Cuba. Can you say a little bit about that and why you think they don't fit into the pattern?
In the case of Cuba, well, what I'm saying is that the conventional pattern is that you first have this honeymoon period of euphoria, and then a cooling down period where it gets a bit more confused, and say intellectuals may still defend it, but in a more defensive way, coming up with excuses rather than just saying how brilliant it is. And then you always get this period in the end where an example is just written off as not real socialism, and then it's considered a straw man or bad form to even mention it. If you mention Venezuela in the presence of a socialist, they will all roll their eyes and say, "Oh, Venezuela again." They will act as if it was the stupidest thing they've ever heard. Socialist regimes always end up in that place normally, where it's always, oh good, he said the Soviet Union, can you imagine, so stupid, that kind of eye-rolling, sneery type of response. In the case of Cuba, that never quite happened. So in my pattern, if you want to keep it in my template with the three phases, you would have to say they are permanently between phase 2 and phase 3. They are stuck somewhere in between. You get some Western socialists who do quite explicitly say, Cuba isn't socialist, I want nothing to do with it, don't hold that against me. And you get some who say, but it's not so bad. And yes, they have some problems, but. So that's classic phase 2 rhetoric, where someone would not present it as the shining city upon the hill anymore, but would still say, but they've got some good some achievements, and the bad stuff, well, we have to see that in context and blame some outside force for that. And that's where Cuba is and has been since, I guess, the 70s, that there was the initial euphoria around the revolution itself, and when Che Guevara was still a major figure, when he was not just a T-shirt but an actual politician who was actively involved. That's when they had their honeymoon period. Yeah, then that cooled down at some point. I can't put an exact year on it, but the fact that they became more similar to the Soviet Union, and the fact that you had lots of refugees arriving in Florida, that kind of helped. That it's a bit difficult to say this is the people's paradise when you are surrounded by refugees from the people's paradise, by actual people who don't want to live there.
Specifically in America, I don't know that there are many other. Well, China may be an example, but how many other examples did America receive the refugees and immigrants from, rather than Western Europe, for instance, of socialist countries?
Yes, in that case, that's true. And I think that's why in the American case, the honeymoon period also ended earlier. But either way, it never, the honeymoon period ended, but it never quite entered that stage of not real socialism. I roll, haha, how can you mention Cuba? Cuba is the one example that you can more or less mention in the presence of socialism. Most of them would admit that it has at least something to do with socialism. It's not it's not just a total straw man. So it still has some defenders, and I'm not quite sure why that is. It could just be that it's become, well, it's partly because it's never been the most atrocious example. Of course, it is a police state, but it's not. It's nothing like what Stalinism was, with mass graves and mass slave labor camps. So it's one of the milder examples of socialism, and there is also the absorption into pop culture. If somebody used fascist symbols on a T-shirt, they would immediately be ostracized for that. Whereas if it's a Che Guevara shirt or a Cuban flag, all of that stuff, that's just pop culture. It's hard to take that too seriously. You sometimes get people on the conservative side who talk about how appalled they are that somebody has a picture of a T-shirt of Che Guevara because he's a mass murderer. But if I'm honest, I don't feel strongly about the Che shirt either way, because I associate that mostly with teenagers, and therefore I just can't take it totally seriously. I may even have had a Che Guevara poster myself back in the day, so I would associate that more with my own 16-year-old silly self than put that on the same level as an apologist for some totalitarian regime. So maybe that's why Cuba has sort of escaped that a bit. And
I don't know how much Cuba differs from other socialist states in terms of what feels like the relevant comparison. You talk about, Cuba is often held up against, or especially early on, against the preceding Batista regime rather than the longer-lived regime before Batista. And then also the rest of Latin America feels like a relevant comparison, maybe as there are more attractive alternatives that are, in the public eye. Cuba will seem it can enter phase 3 or something.
Yes, that's one of the big differences. That's exactly right. That you had for many other regimes, you just have the comparison. For North Korea, it's obviously South Korea. That's the counterfactual. For Maoism, it would be Taiwan or Hong Kong, places that prospered and developed. Whereas for Cuba, well, firstly, it's an island state, and it's surrounded by a lot of poor countries. So therefore, at least in the 70s, 80s, when Cuba was still more popular than it is now, it was not implausible to say, well, Cuba is not obviously worse off than many other countries in that region. There were just lots of dictatorships in Latin America. There were lots of poor countries, and you could say, okay, it's not a place where you have freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, but that's true in many of their neighbors too. And while you will not get rich in Cuba, while you won't get a Western type living standard, neither do they have extreme poverty, and that's something which they, you say, did have that a lot of their neighbors didn't. So it was initially they didn't have ambitious counterfactuals. So you could see why somebody would say, well, okay, Cuba is not obviously uniquely bad, and that would have been correct. Now it's a bit different. There are now middle-income countries. Most Latin American countries now are middle-income countries. It's no longer the case that Latin America means poverty and underdevelopment. I mean, it does range from some lower middle incomes to some quite developed ones. I mean, Chile is clearly a first world country now. Uruguay is nowadays a first world country. You get the Costa Ricas, you get some success stories there. If you compare Cuba to those, it looks pretty grim. And I'd say that's the more relevant comparison, because Cuba was already quite highly developed around the time of the revolution. It's not that they would ever have been like Haiti or Guatemala. That the issues that those other countries have or had until recently with very high child mortality, low life expectancy. That was, even in the 50s, that was not an issue anymore in Cuba. They already had, by the standards of that region, they had fairly high life expectancy. That most people could read and write. So it's not that they were starting from zero. They were already fairly highly developed and were already improving and would have improved with or without the revolution. But that's something that an economist would know, somebody who looks into the figures would know. It's not immediately obvious. So therefore, it's I can't blame someone for saying, well, okay, Cuba, of course they're not rich, but are they obviously worse than Guatemala or El Salvador? Not so clear.
And then East Germany is the other example that doesn't fit the pattern, but in a different way than Cuba.
Yes, they never had a honeymoon period in the sense that you had large waves of enthusiastic support. And that's because it was, during the Cold War, there was an emphasis on, the Eastern Bloc was presented as a bloc, as a homogeneous bloc. Few people would have known a great deal about the difference between the Soviet Union and Poland and East Germany and Hungary. They would have just, that's mostly the way it's presented in Cold War spy thrillers. I just read a novel which is set in the Cold War, and there is somebody who travels to East Germany, and it is presented as a complete Soviet puppet state, which I don't think is true. I don't think that's really quite how it was, but that's how it was seen. It was just a copy of the Soviet Union at a higher level of development, since Germany was of course much more highly developed before. Eastern Germany was much more highly developed before it became socialist than the Soviet Union was, so that they didn't have to build industries from scratch. Since Soviet socialism by that time was already discredited, nobody could have realistically claimed that East Germany is somehow a fresh start. That's normally what new socialist regimes need. If they want to be popular with Western intellectuals, they need that distance from the previous ones. They need to be able to say, we will not be like that. And that was the case in Cuba, clearly, because it was a homegrown revolution. They became allies of the Soviets, but it's not that they tried actively to replicate the Soviet system, whereas East Germany was clearly oriented towards the Soviet Union. So nobody could have said, this is a complete fresh start, and they will not make the mistakes of the Soviets again. So, I guess it's also just a place that doesn't lend itself so easily to romanticism. If in the case of Cuba, I guess it blended a bit, and Venezuela, it blended a bit with more general Western backpacker Latin America romanticism, whereas an East German city would have just looked like a West German city, but gray and dull and probably quite boring. So it didn't have that romanticism.
Do you think it also requires a charismatic leader? I don't know if there were any particularly charismatic East German leaders, but is that also a common thread in Western intellectual excitement?
Yes, that usually happens. You have Mao, Ho Chi Minh, Castro, Che Guevara. Chavez had that role for a while. Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, at least in the 80s. Not now. Here, the second installment, interesting, is not so popular. But that's usually part of it. And East Germany didn't have that. If you lived there, you would have known the name of the general secretary of the Socialist Party. An outside observer wouldn't have known that. And there was nothing about a particular figure. What they had going for them was that they presented themselves as the anti-fascist Germany. They said that their regime was composed of people who were part of the anti-Nazi resistance. And that was partly true. Some of them were people who were persecuted by the Nazis, who had survived in exile, or who were even active in the resistance. Erich Honecker, who was later the general secretary, he was literally in a Nazi prison for, I think, a decade. So you could say, well, these were people who had made personal sacrifices and who stood for a certain kind of idealism, by virtue of their biographies, and they knew how to blend that with the way they presented their regime. East German self-presentation was always that they said, West Germany is a quasi-fascist state. That's where all the Nazis went. That's the bad Germany. That's where the baddies went. But we're the good guys here. We are the ones who were part of the resistance, and we represent the fresh start. And Marxists also had this particular interpretation that they thought fascism was just the most extreme form of capitalism. That they had this idea that the Nazis were actually put in power by capitalists who felt threatened, and therefore they could, the East German leaders could then say, "Oh, look, those industrialists, some of whom supported the Nazi regime, they're still there. Look at this person, look at that person. Aren't those familiar names?" And they could say, "We here, we don't do that because we don't have private industry anymore."
It's interesting that East Germany never received much Western support, but you also talk about how it's, in terms of all of the examples we have, it's probably about as good as it gets in terms of actual living standards and numbers and lack of serious like it was an authoritarian police state, but maybe similar to Cuba, it doesn't come anywhere close to the horror stories of Maoism or Stalinism. And it's actually relatively one of the better examples.
Yes, of course, it started at a higher level, because even though Eastern Germany just after the war would have looked completely bombed out, it was actually a lot of the capital stock, the infrastructure had survived. It was not that they literally had to build everything from zero. It was just that a lot of it was unusable, because that's if you have, let's say, a factory where an important part is missing, or where there are no railway tracks leading to that factory. If that's bombed, then you can't use it for now, and it looks industrial production, industrial output will be abysmally low. It looks as if you're starting from zero again, but you're not really. You can repair a lot of what you've inherited, and you therefore start with a higher level of development. You start with a capital stock and advanced technology that the Soviet Union didn't have after the revolution. So they were a developed country before, and therefore maintained a certain edge. And I'm glad I grew up on the right side of the inner German border, but nonetheless, it was not that they had starvation or anything. It just meant living standards would be quite Spartan.
You go through 8 or 10 or so examples of socialist states, but your book has obviously had to be limited for length. What are some socialist societies you would have most liked to include a chapter on in your book that you weren't able to?
Well, I have a colleague who is interested in, African development, mostly present-day development. They have an attempt to build a free trade area now, and he looks at that mainly. But he's also interested in Marxist regimes in Africa, and he asked me after the book came out, why didn't you have something on Angola and Mozambique, the People's Republics? They had a period of...
Was Idi Amin socialist?
I don't know enough about that. There are sometimes borderline cases where you can't clearly say. But he says a lot of those, Zimbabwe perhaps, would fall into that category, that there were African Marxist regimes that did have Western supporters, not on a massive scale, not on a scale that everyone would know about it, but they were nonetheless there. And when he mentioned that, I thought that's a good point. It's just that those were regimes that I knew relatively little about, so it would have taken a lot more time to find out. And once you already have about 8 examples, adding a 9th or 10th doesn't add that much to the book anymore. There comes a point when the reader says, "Okay, I get the pattern. I believe you. Can you shut up now?" But yeah, if that weren't an issue, I could have found a lot more examples.
I don't know if you've seen the film The Last King of Scotland. That's why Idi Amin came to mind. It's largely about that, a particular Western pilgrim who's very taken with his new revolutionary regime. And I don't recall if it's specifically socialist or just a grassroots people's revolution kind of, and his personal journey to start second guessing what he's seeing and then ultimately to realize this is not so pretty.
Yeah, that sounds familiar. That sounds like that could have made a chapter.
Can you say a little bit about where people can find you if they want to see what you're up to, follow you on social media or anything like that?
Yes, sure. I'm on Twitter, actively battling the commies on a day-to-day basis. That is at K_Niemietz, Niemietz. And otherwise, I've got plenty of other publications on on the website of the Institute of Economic Affairs, iea.org.uk. If you click on research or publications, that will all come up. Some of it on socialism, some on completely different subjects.
And are you working on any new projects right now? Any new books or?
I've got a paper coming out, which is, that's a more specifically British topic. That's we often have waves of panic, moral panics around the National Health Service. There are recurring conspiracy theories that there's a secret plan to privatize the NHS. And that there never was such a plan, but people keep saying that and have been regularly for over 40 years. It just will not go away. So it's almost a bit like with socialism that you can find quotes from many years apart that sound very similar. You only have to change a name and a date. And it's another idea that just cannot be refuted by experience.
Last question. Do you have any books or authors or papers you would recommend that you think are a good complement to your book?
That would clearly be, you mentioned the Paul Hollander book. That's my main source for the first 3 country examples for the Soviet Union, Maoist, China, and Cuba. He is my main source there. So he is, well, I think it was first published in 1980. He did this quite a while ago. He documents, in his case, it's all about what I call the honeymoon phase. He doesn't do the phases in the way I do. He concentrates on the phases when Western intellectuals are fawning over socialist regimes, and it's called Political Pilgrims. That was both a source that I actively used, but also an inspiration that showed me. I had some idea of this before, but that showed me this is actually bigger than I realized. There's a lot going on there.
Kristian, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
That was Kristian Niemietz, and his book is Socialism, the Failed Idea That Never Dies. You can purchase it on Amazon, and you can also find links to that book, as well as other topics discussed in today's episode in the show notes. If you're enjoying what I do here, please subscribe to Ideas Having Sex with Chris Kaufman on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or Stitcher. And please rate and review the show. It's a small thing, but it really helps us grow. So I thank you in advance for doing that. I'm Chris Kaufman. Thanks for listening.